Hey, what is going on, everyone? We are going live. Actually, my first live. David will be hopping on shortly, and we're going to get into it. I am super excited for this. We're going to be talking about everything accelerated learning, note taking, how to apply it to your writing, and how to find your voice. So, David, when you see me go live on my story, request access, and then happy to get you going. To anyone, if you hear noises in the background, it is loud because we are. Oh, there he is. David has sent you. Awesome. Cool. So David will be hopping on in a second.
Brett,
Hey,
my good
what's
sir.
going on?
How are you?
How are you?
I'm
I'm
great.
good.
How's Miami?
It's good. There is many boxes in my room in my apartment because tomorrow the moving people are coming. I'm going 5 blocks down there, so it's gonna be so
Exciting.
it's a bit
Fun stuff.
stressful.
Cool.
Moving's never fun, but I'm excited.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
What's going
All
on with
right.
you?
Same old man. Just, doing student stuff, doing business stuff, hanging out. This is my apartment. Very small apartment. This is everything, everybody. This is the kitchen and the bedroom and the office and the living
That's
room.
it. That's a New York life.
It is exactly, exactly.
When are you moving to your new place?
I'm actually staying here for the year, so I'm going to be in this studio on the Lower East Side until May, and then we'll figure out next moves. That's when I
Cool.
graduate. So,
I love it.
yeah.
So people are starting to pile in. I'm so excited for to talk to David. One, because he's a dear friend of mine. Two, because he's ridiculously smart, and there is certain aspects of what he's really good at that I want to dive in. I'm lucky to be friends with a lot of smart and attractive people. David, though, when I connected with him through my business partner, who is his mentor, John Romanello, instantly when we started talking, I was like, all right, this kid knows what he's talking about. But then when we dove deeper and developed a closer friendship, your ability to consume information, retain information, and apply it to what you're doing in life really captivated me. And so I wanted to dive deeper on that topic today.
Yeah, thank you for the kind words. I think it's definitely one of my strengths. I'm not particularly gifted at anything, I don't think, but I have just found a good system to be really good at learning. And when you
Cool.
are really good at learning, you can be really good at anything because it's a meta skill that improves all skills.
That is true. So before we dive in, I want to give a little bit of background for who David is and what he's doing, and then you guys can. I would highly recommend follow him, and then start following his work, reading about the blogs he puts out in his writing because it's so good. Um, David's a writer, personal trainer, and co-owner of Roman Fitness Systems. He's a head editor of ProHockeyStrength.com, the official website of NHL strength coaches. He's worked with athletes and coaches from beginners to NCAA Division I in professional hockey. He's originally from Vermont. David lives in New York and studies at New York University. And he loves books, pop punk music, Vermont maple syrup, and heavy split squats.
That's my bio.
That's your bio. Um, and David is the epitome of what that TikTok that's like when the person's saying, this is not, mom, this is not a phase, it's a lifestyle, because you are a huge champion of the pop punk movement
Huge
and
pop
you'll
punk guy. Yeah.
never let it
No.
die.
Nope.
Cool. So let's get into it. We have some questions that people asked, as well as just some thoughts that I am pulling up because I want to dive into this. I actually see one of my old mentors, Graham, on the call, and Graham, I took a course with him about Bob Proctor, and it reminds me of my favorite quote. It says, thoughts become things, and if you see it in your mind, you'll hold it in your hands. And David, when you talk about how you study, one of the most interesting things about you is like how you've been able to manifest a lot of this into your life. So I want to first pull it back and say, how did you learn this skill of obtaining a lot of information, but most importantly, or taking a lot of information, but most importantly, retaining it?
Yeah, I think after high school, I decided to take a gap year, and in that gap year, I did a few things, basically three things. I continued playing hockey at what's called junior hockey, which is like pre-college, post-high school. I worked as a personal trainer at a gym, and I traveled a lot. My initial impetus to get into accelerated learning started because right after high school, I had the opportunity to go to Spain. And for context, I have that Spanish last name. My last name is Rosales. My dad is from El Salvador, a Spanish speaking country in Latin America. but my mom's a white girl from Massachusetts. And so even though half my family spoke Spanish, I grew up only speaking English. And I was really insecure about it. And when I had the opportunity to go to Spain, that was when I was like, okay, if I can't learn while I'm in Spain for a month, then there's really going to be no chance for me to learn this language. And that was one of the first pivotal moments where I started just like read a lot about accelerated learning, about language learning. And then after that experience, I would apply to pretty much everything.
Cool. Now, that's interesting. So you went over to Spain to pick up the language. Walk me through that at first. Why? So you want to do it because you're family, but what was the process when you're starting to learn Spanish quickly?
Yeah, and I'll try to make this for everybody because I think language learning is a good place to start because it's something we all have a bit of experience with. Obviously, we all speak our native language, but also most of us have taken French or Spanish in high school or some kind of language in high school. And we all know what it's like to get a verb chart and you're like, okay, you're going to go, soy, eres, somos, soy, son. And you think you're okay at Spanish because you can memorize those verb charts and you can memorize all this vocabulary. But then how often do we all just like, you talk to someone who took Spanish in high school, like, oh yeah, I forgot all of it. Or even took it in college, like, oh yeah, I forgot all of it. And that is, I think, a good example of the big disconnect in the way we go about learning. We think that learning is something you memorize. You think you read a book and it's just like in your brain, when really that's not how any learning works at all, especially language learning. In the context of language learning, the biggest reframe is that languages aren't something you memorize. Languages are something you get used to.
Oh, okay.
So think about the way you speak English. Brett, why do you have an American accent? Like pretty neutral American accent. It's just because the people around you have that kind of accent. Why do you even use the certain words you use? How often are we in our groups of friends and they'll start saying words and we'll be like, that's a really annoying word. And then you'll just say it without thinking. Like 2 weeks later, like, how did that word get in my brain? I hate this word. This is the worst word ever, and now I'm using it.
Yeah.
And we say all the time in social media, there's kind of like these, communities of different dialects and languages. In hockey, for example, we have our whole other set of words. And that's the way we should go about language learning and really learning anything, is it's something you get used to. It's about pattern recognition. When I started to learn Spanish, the biggest realization for me was that I needed to forget all of the verb tenses and all this vocab that I learned. It was kind of useful as like a jumping off point, like to know a little bit about, the basic structure of grammar. But what was 1,000 times more valuable is just asking a question, saying it wrong, and then your friend goes, actually, you say it this way. And then next time you say it better. And it might take 4 or 5 times until I like get the phrase down and I'm working on the pronunciation every time I use it. So it's really about pattern recognition, and that's about repetition. So when you're trying to learn a language and trying to learn anything, there's something to be said for just pattern recognition, pattern recognition, pattern recognition. And that applies to really anything, not just, it applies to working out. Like you're not going to cognitively understand an exercise and do it well. You're going to have to do it a few times over the course of a few weeks before you've really like mastered it.
Okay. That makes sense. But let's apply it, because a lot of the people watching this, there are also entrepreneurs and the analysis by paralysis is something I still struggle with, right? There's so much information I want to consume, marketing, reading, et cetera, whatever it is. How do you decide this is what I want to dive into so I can get the pattern recognition to obviously excel at it?
I think that should begin. So the question is, how do you choose what to consume?
Yeah.
This is a hard question. I don't think there's any great answer. I think people should start, if let's say you're a non-reader, you're like, oh, I've always hated reading. I think this is a lot the same thing with writing too. People like hate writing because in high school they were told to write about like Shakespeare's sonnet and Hamlet. And like that's, for some people that's cool, that's great if that's your thing, but most of us are just like, we're not that interested in Hamlet. He's kind of just like a whiny kid, right? So my first suggestion would be to go for content that really speaks to you. I would even go as far to say it doesn't have to be a book. Do you prefer learning through audio? Do you prefer podcasts, audiobooks? Do you prefer even TV? Like there's a lot to learn from like really good TV. So if books and like the kind of books I read, which I read a lot of like fiction, if those books don't speak to you, like you don't have to read, James Joyce's Ulysses. Like no one has to read that. Just like you don't have to read War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. I haven't read that yet. Right. So I think there's this like, oh, if I read, I have to be this like literary person. I don't think that's true at all. I think you should just start with the content that speaks to you and then find ways. We'll talk about note-taking strategies, the strategies to then retain that information.
Okay. So give people a window into what you consume. So you said fiction, but what else?
Okay. I listen to podcasts. Yeah. I listen to like Tim Ferriss's podcast. This is probably my favorite. I listen to a couple like sciencey podcasts. Peter Attia is a good science podcast I really like. I read fiction all the time. and then I listen to nonfiction. This is how my process has evolved over time, where I like cannot stand reading these like personal development nonfiction books anymore, and they make me want to like throw the book across the room. So I just listen to them and then save my like actual reading time for fiction that I'm reading more with the intent of just like hearing good stories and improving my storytelling and writing, as opposed to like extracting a certain concept from it.
Okay, that's interesting. And then was that because when you were reading more personal development books, was it like, I've heard this concept over and over again, it was hard to relate to? Because I understand with fiction, because it's a story, you get captivated in it.
Yeah.
Walk me through the throwing the book of the nonfiction.
Yeah, it's really just like all nonfiction personal development books, they kind of have the same, not all of them, most of them have the same format. And I just know what's coming. I've just read so many of them. I just know what they're going to say. And I'm like, this book could have been an article. This should have just been an article. You didn't need to write this book, but you wrote this book because it's good for your brand, which is totally fine. I just don't want to read it personally at this point. I'll listen to it, but I don't want to like sit down and read it necessarily.
Okay.
that's another, I think that's like an important also thing for people who are struggling to like decide what to read and like, everyone keeps telling me to read this. I don't really want to read this. There's a really great concept from one of the most influential books on my life. It's called The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin. Now, Josh Waitzkin was, in his youth, a chess prodigy. You know, he was the basis of the book Searching for Bobby Fischer, who was the only U.S. chess world champion. And in that book, he talks about how his natural tendency as a chess player was to be this very attacking player. Like he didn't really like playing defense. And one of his coaches suggested that he study a player named Anatoly Karpov, who was a world champion known for his like really good defense and prophylactic play, where he would just like strangle opponents like a snake. And Josh found it really hard to relate to Karpov's play, and his defense didn't necessarily improve. Then he had another coach suggest that he learn how to play defense through an offensive player. So he suggested he learn from Garry Kasparov, who's another world champion, but he is much more in line with Josh's style of playing. So the concept there is learn Karpov through Kasparov. In your case, everyone might be telling you to read this book, but do you need to read that book, or could you have one of your friends who you really trust summarize the main points to you? I'll give an example from my life. I really like Ryan Holiday stuff. I think he does a great job of distilling Stoicism. I actually have not read that much Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus or Seneca. I have not read that much because I think Ryan Holiday has done an amazing job of distilling the key concepts into everyday modern American vernacular. And so I'm learning Seneca through Holiday. I'm learning Karpov through Kasparov. And so the tendency to be like, I really need to read this book. I would actually question that. Do you actually need to read this book, or do you need to find your Kasparov to that Karpov?
Interesting. So on that note, it's less about, you may not need to go back to the root of it, but what you're doing is finding someone who you enjoy their already style and then their take on it. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Okay.
Find the right translator for you. Find the right who can really translate those concepts for you. And that's going to be different. Like we all have different people who we really trust for certain things, I think. So find your people for different things.
That's a really good concept. Because for me, like when I first started in this, similar, I'm very, and we'll talk about this later, too much like in the warrior energy of like, you must do these things, very like disciplined, thinking I have to kind of go through the entrepreneurial, bullshit in order to get to the other side of it. And then I realized I couldn't relate to certain things. So that's why I actually really enjoy learning my content from email marketing, like really good email lists from like Justin Goff, people I can like relate to, like their stories of how they're explaining things. I like that you brought that up. So for someone that's looking to evolve themselves and looking to get to the next level, but they haven't necessarily maybe found, that the Ryan Holiday for them, how do you recommend that they figure that out?
How do they find the right sources? That's a really hard, like, just find people who speak to you. Who do you like? Who could you just listen to for hours? Whose books, the minute you stop reading, you want to just rewatch them again, reread them again. Same thing with TV. Like what actors really speak to you? What comedians really speak to you? What content creators are just like really speaking to your soul? For me, I'll
a short list.
Context on John. So John Romanello is your boss, my mentor. Obviously, we both work closely with him. I started following his stuff in 8th grade. I read his book when I was in 8th grade. And what spoke to me about him, what I really like, there are a lot of things that are definitely deep below my consciousness. But at that time, it was, here's a guy who writes about fitness in an entertaining way, right? He was a translator for all these like sciencey, confusing topics and put them into plain English, right? And that's like, he was my Kasparov for a lot of like scientific research, right? So just like find who speaks to you. I mean, I don't have a perfect answer for like how exactly you can find who speaks to you. I think it's
But
pretty
that's good.
individual.
It's good to hear how you will interpret it and how you figure it out, because I always like learning from someone, like their process of it, right? So that's helpful. Now, okay, speak to the people that we've been, they very busy day. They carve out that hour a day, whatever it is, to consume knowledge. How are they retaining it? What's your note-taking strategy?
Yes, this is another big misconception. I'll even go back to language learning with this. So in 4 weeks, I become conversationally fluent. I come back, everyone's like, what the heck happened? I remember one of my best friends, Marcel, in Spain, after 2 days, he was like, David, in his like thick accent, he's like, you learned so fast, which is really funny. And it's like this memory ingrained in my head. But I came back from Spain. Now I'm back in Vermont, where I'm from. Now Vermont is super white, so no one speaks Spanish. All I have is my grandparents. And I needed strategies to keep retaining the language. I decided to read all of the Harry Potter books in Spanish. I would alternate. I read the first book in English and the first book in Spanish, and the second book in English and the second book in Spanish. Because I know the story so well, and I had just read in English, it really helped me like fill in gaps in my vocabulary and see how things are translated and structured. But the point to that is, once you learn something, it's not just in your brain forever. You have to keep applying it. And languages, we all get rusty. I even think in our everyday lives, like if there's a concept you were obsessed with a year ago, you're just not going to be as sharp with it as you are now.
Yeah.
Personally, for me, chess is like the perfect example of this. If I don't play chess for like 3 days, I'm like, wow, my tactical vision is way off today. Like way off. Like you constantly have to be sharpening the axe. And that means our strategies for learning retention need to revolve around how can we continually apply it, or at least have a quick way to go back to it when we need it.
Okay.
I can now outline my specific note-taking process, so that would be helpful. I read a book. So I'll read a book, and there's a whole different highlight system, but let's just say some important concept comes up and you highlight it. You highlight that concept, you're like, I want to remember this.
I'm sorry, let me just ask a quick question.
Yes.
Let's say you're reading fiction, okay?
Yes.
So it's not a personal development as do this in order to, but you just read a line that the author wrote that's very interesting.
Yep.
Is that also highlighted in this instance?
Yes, I actually underline beautiful phrases, and this is one of my they're these little books, these little small journals I keep next to my books when I'm reading, and then when I highlight them, when I underline them, when I'm done reading for the day, I'll write them in this little notebook. So all of the best phrases I've read, I'll put in here. That's called commonplace book, and most great writers have some kind of commonplace system where when we hear great language, we write it down. Right.
Cool. Okay, so continue off that.
Yes, with something like, and even in fiction books, like I think George Orwell, actually, like a lot of his nonfiction is like, this is nonfiction, but it's literary nonfiction. Homage to Catalonia, which is one of my favorite books. There's a lot of highlights that I would highlight because I love the information, not only the way it's written. So even with someone like him, I'll take the highlights from that book, and then I'll take a journal. I have these crappy notebooks. I have like a table of contents, and I'll copy verbatim the highlight. This is not revolutionary. This is very simple. That actually does nothing for learning. In terms of retaining information, just copying the thing verbatim, you're going to forget it. You're not going to really understand it. The most important part to going from conceptually understanding something to be able to integrate it into who you are and then apply it is you need to translate that, going back to the Kasparov through Karpov through Kasparov concept, you need to translate that into words that make sense to you.
Mm.
For me, whatever that highlight makes me think of, I then, like I'm journaling, I'll write like a few lines like, oh, this reminds me of X, Y, Z. This makes me think of this concept. So sometimes I'll hold my journal to be like, this is like 1,000 True Fans, or like, this is like Neil Strauss, 2 crappy pages per day. I have all this like bank of like concepts in my head. And when I think of something, I'll connect it right back.
Okay. You're anchoring it to something that you'll remember.
And I'm very glad you said the word anchoring, because psychologically in copywriting, you know how this works as well, right? So why don't you explain what anchoring is in copywriting?
So anchoring, when someone's reading a page, I like to put an idea generally near the top of it that reminds them of something. And then when they get down the page again, have them be reminded of it from a feeling or sensation they get from looking at that word or phrase. That allows them, by the time they opt into the product, that they associate that with a good feeling of which they're trying to achieve.
Right. So an example of anchoring that, it would be like, this workout program's $30. It's like the price of 3 Chipotle burritos with guac. which the fitness audience would be like, oh yeah, it's just three burritos with guac. Like I get that every week. So I'll just like not have burritos for a week and then I'll basically get this for free.
Yeah.
And that is connecting what you're learning to something you already know. For like a chess example, the most mind-blowing thing about chess is watching masters play blindfolded. Like you tell them to move. They're like E4, E5, and they'll be able to see it. But chess players can do that because they have the pattern recognition so far down. If you're like, hey, this is just a Najdorf Sicilian, and black just played pawn B5. Like I can picture that in my brain right now, and I'm nowhere near as good as them. So for them, they just have this bank of what George Steiner would call pre-information, and pre-information is just like this bank of context we have that then helps us relate to it. So using your bank of existing knowledge is absolutely crucial when you go and do note taking. Our friend Bryce Calvin, what he does is after he takes his notes, he'll then, with a recorder, speak out the concepts in his own language, in his own words. So he'll go from verbatim and then say it in his own words. So another way to practice would be like, okay, I know this concept. I'm going to try to explain it to a friend. Right? This is to teach is to learn. If you can explain it to a friend, you're going to understand it a lot better than if you're just like trying to write notes about it. So the core concept there is you need to connect what you're learning to what you already know.
Got it. That makes sense. So then we have that process. We're connecting it to what we know. How often what are you reviewing? The actual notes themselves or the connection of the notes? How do you keep that sharp?
Yeah, it's like, okay, I read the 48 Laws of Power. I have that in my notes. It's actually not in this journal, it's in the next one, but I'm like, oh, this is like, what's that thing, the 48 Laws of Power? I just grab my notebook, I flip to the page, and I not only read what Robert Greene wrote, I now even remember exactly what I was thinking about it at the time and how I related to it at the time. So I'm like, oh yes, this is exactly how I'm applying this.
Do you ever get into the game of telephone though, where it gets too far removed from the actual source that you're kind of not making up, but like it's not as factual as from the original source?
That is like, yes, I mean, that is the concern. But I think like, again, if we're thinking like as like a spectrum, I think you'd rather be somewhere you can understand it than too far than like in this, like, okay, this is just complete gibberish at this point. This is just word salad. I'm not grasping any of this. So yes, you can do that. But I think as long as that's why I do write down the verbatim notes, part of the reason, because I do want to ground it, because like there's a saying, a man never goes to the same river because it's not the same river. It's not the same man. Like what that text means to you is going to evolve as you reread it and relook at it. So yes, you want to maintain grounded in some way. And there are people who explain things poorly on the internet. And that is one of the challenges. So you do need to be able to decipher information in some way. But I think in terms of note taking and understanding, it's err on the side of like good communication, I think.
Right. Okay. So for our visual friends at home, you're taking like your journal and then you're writing down the actual quote and then you're writing down. Yeah. Show us.
Let me see if I can.
Because I know some of our friends that are watching, they are definitely visual people and they're like, help me. So I got you.
Yes. This is from, let's see. What's a book most people have read? Most people have read The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by.
Yeah. This has been super helpful because this was a struggle of mine where I'm very disciplined in my day. So I'll like, okay, this is my hour reading time, but then the retention of it is a whole nother monster that I'm really glad we're tackling.
Okay. So Subtle Art. This was actually, can I turn my camera around?
Yes, you should be able to.
Boop. You guys can see my feet and my notebook. So this was an audiobook actually. So while I listened to audiobooks, and you can see the date, this is from 2019, chapter 1, quote, and then whatever I had in blue.
Okay, so got it. Just sorry to interrupt. Is certain colors, are they meaning anything to you or just the pens you have available?
So I read once when I was probably 19 that blue pens you retain better. I don't know if that's true. I think Jim Quick told me that on a podcast. Yeah. I'm not positive though. And I think I just ran with it. And I thought, okay, black pen verbatim, blue pen is going to be my thoughts.
Cool.
And then I'll even highlight things sometimes. So this is Essentialism. These are the type of books that your kind of audience would definitely read.
Yeah.
Right. And then I'll highlight something. I have all the chapters. This was also an audiobook. So these audiobooks for sure go quicker in terms of note taking versus something like the 48 Laws of Power, which I have a physical copy. That notebook, that's not this one. That notebook is much longer.
Okay. And are you, Are you taking notes in the margins, or are you just like, no, I'm gonna underline it and then I'm gonna put my notes in a
Yes.
journal?
While I read, notes in the margins are basically my blue pen. My blue pen. So I highlight it and then I make a note why I highlighted it. That way when I go and review it, it's like, oh, this is why I thought it was important, because it connected to this.
That's an interesting point. So it's not the starting and stopping. You're reading for X amount of time, and then you have a certain amount of time to later on to transfer the thoughts from the book to your journal. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. Basically what I'm doing at all times, Brett, is I'm always reading a novel. I'm always, or like a literary nonfiction book. I'm always listening to a nonfiction book, and I'm always reviewing a book.
Okay.
So during my review process is when I'll go back. That's not how you have to do it, obviously. That's just what is work for me.
Yeah. Well, I like that because we're in very similar industries, and that's why it's like interesting always seeing how you're transferring it over, which actually brings me to the next topic I want to dive into, which is, okay, we're now reading more, we're now retaining more. How do we write better? How do we then take this and help us better explain it in the words that we're putting on page?
Okay. When I was 18 and I was working at a gym, I was actually a very, very good science student in high school, and I was good at English because I was good at most things in school because I'm just good at school. But like I was a lot better at science. I was way, way better at science. I did not identify as a writer. I was not like, oh, I'm such a good writer. And like growing up, teachers would be like, your science and math is so good, but your writing is pretty average. And I'm like, oh, whatever. I hate writing. Then I graduated high school, and without school, my brain was like, David, you have all these things to say. What do you get? Where are you going to say them? And my gym at the time had a blog. And so I decided to start writing on that blog. At that time, writing was not, writing was just to translate my thoughts onto paper. And that is how I principally think about writing. I think some people think about writing as like, oh, I already know what my thoughts are, and now I'm just going to like put them on paper and they're going to be perfect. I think of writing as a way to clarify my thinking. Because when you put what you're thinking in your head down onto paper, it forces you to confront that it might not be clear as you thought it was. It forces you to confront that the language you're using is inadequate, is mediocre, is unclear.
Okay.
Then in the editing process of your writing, that's when you're like, oh, I'm seeing how this thought process is not serving me in any way. George Orwell, I think if you read one George Orwell thing, make it his essay called The Politics of English Language, where political language, and even like language of most industries, even like in our community, like spiritual language, the problem with like political and spiritual language sometimes is it doesn't invoke images, it doesn't invoke scenes. And when it doesn't have a specific image attached to it, then you can interpret it in many different ways. As a result, your thinking is going to be unclear by the nature of the word choice you're using.
Okay.
In politics, strategists do this on purpose to make their slogans appear not as crappy as they are. For example, and this is called the ladder of abstraction. So the ladder of abstraction is like at the bottom of the ladder, you have like a very clear-cut sentence. At the top, you have this like super vague thing. So for example, Republicans in the mid-2000s reframed, this is not a judgment. Politics is just like, this is literally what they did from a marketing perspective. They, instead of saying drilling for oil, which when I say drilling for oil, I think we can all imagine oil coming up out of the earth. They changed that to then say exploring for energy. And exploring for energy is much more vague. It actually means nothing. Exploring means nothing. Energy means nothing. But in their head, it's synonymous with drilling for oil. And that was a lot less provocative to voters. Voters were much less likely to vote against exploring for energy than they were to vote against drilling for oil. And that is the ladder of abstraction. So in our thinking and our writing, we want to make sure that we're not too high up the ladder of abstraction. We want to get as low on the ladder of abstraction as possible.
Unless you're trying to persuade a message to do something.
Unless you're trying to be a scummy copywriter, which like is, I guess people do that. Like people try. I'm sure you know people who write like that. Like, oh, this sounds bad. I need to write it this way. But like for our purpose, if we're just writing for ourselves to clarify our thinking, our learning, and share our thoughts, generally speaking, we want to be as clear as possible. Okay. I didn't remember what your question was, but
you're doing good. Don't worry.
Cool.
So when I first started writing, one of the first things that was always taught to me is, write drunk, edit sober is a
Hmm.
similar concept for you too. The whole idea of like your first draft, you're just gonna like vomit everything on page and then go ahead and touch it up. How are you going through your actual writing process?
Yes, write drunk, edit sober. I think every writer would vouch for that pretty much. Because you're writing drunk, that doesn't mean actually drunk. That just means like say everything
Unless
you
you
have to
want.
say. That is going to be what you're actually thinking. So you want to write at the same speed you're thinking in a sense and see what your thinking actually is. And that is when you realize it's not as clear as you thought it was.
Yeah.
And that is when you go in and do the editing process, you can challenge and push your thinking and clarify things.
Good. So for our people that are watching and you're writing a lot, that is something that took me such a long time to overcome because I would stare at the screen and then I would write a sentence and read it back, be like, I'm not sure, and it would make my writing time so much longer. But then I learned write it, let it go, come back to it, and that just made my because I have to be disciplined in my day, so I have to like have things very planned out, and that helped me like really streamline my process.
Yep. Lower
So
the
that's a big
stakes.
takeaway. Lower the
Lower the stakes
stakes.
for sure. Make it as easy for yourself as possible to write, to just like
Cool.
get the words on the page. No one's gonna read that first draft.
So as we're winding to a close with this, I want to talk about because I got a lot of questions on finding your writing voice. First off, can you explain that concept and then explain the process in doing that?
Yes, this is a good question. John Romano has I think he has a good article on this as well on his
Yeah.
website. Writing voice is how your voice translates onto writing. Ideally, if we're good speakers, when we write, people will read that writing like, oh, this is clearly this person, and it's an entertaining, it's a fun voice. It's clearly them. Like
Yeah.
it's definitely them. My favorite writer who I think does voice incredibly well is J.D. Salinger. His characters have just such like they sound so real and so like
Yeah.
them. The way I think about writing voices, kind of like we were talking about language learning, that even learning English, we absorb the voices of the people around us. There's a popular saying in personal development that is, you're the average of the five people you spend the most time with.
Yeah.
We've all heard this, and you can interpret that as, okay, so if you want to be better, you need better people around you, 100%. When it comes to writing voice, our voice is going to be the average of the five people you spend the most time with. If you spend enough time with one person, you will start to adopt their mannerisms and their aneurysms and the way they speak and these phrases, all these things. You'll naturally start to do it. In the context of writing then, if you want to improve your writing voice, find writers who you want to write like, who you want to talk like. After I do this thing where I'm in fiction right now, where I'm reading everything a writer ever wrote. So in the fall, I read everything Salinger wrote. And then this winter, I read everything Hemingway wrote. And right now, I'm reading everything George Orwell wrote. And my writing right now sounds like a little bit more like George Orwell, just because I'm like so in his voice and getting to know him. So take that, you're the average of the five people, and apply that to your writing practice. Whose voice do you really like? Do you really like
So
Hemingway's style? Mm-hmm.
that's interesting because that part put something in my brain. Are you picking the person you're reading based on the style of writing that you'll be doing for that season?
I just picked, that should be more, I'm just like, Orwell seems great. I'm going to read him now. I'll read like one essay. I'm like, okay, I can commit to this for the next 3 months and read everything he ever wrote. But if you want to improve writing voice, I think the key is to be reading writers whose voice you like. And your voice naturally, like I had an Instagram post about this like a month ago, is you have to imitate before you innovate. Like you're gonna spend a lot of time sounding like the writers you like and like the people you're around before you find your own voice. Right? I'm never gonna write like Salinger, I'm never gonna write like Orwell, and I'm never gonna write like John. But if I spend a lot of time with John, spend a lot of time with Orwell, spend a lot of time with Salinger, spend a lot of time with Hemingway, spend a lot of time with Maggie Nelson, who I've been reading a lot, I'm going to just absorb some of their habits into my writing voice, and I'll come up with this like fusion that's unique to me.
I really like that. So we actually just got a question live, and that reminds me, people feel free to comment or ask any questions live. And the question, let me pull it back up, was from Paul, who said, when is the best time of day to learn?
When is the best time of day to learn is all the time. You should be always learning. No, I think the question really is, what time should I set aside to read? It's just like, I get this question about working out all the time.
Yeah.
And it's, what's the best time for you? What time works best in your day? What time works best in your day to sit down and commit to reading for 30 minutes or whatever?
That's actually,
10 minutes.
for me, because this was a big struggle, I found that, the phrase of like, was it eat the entire elephant or do the most difficult thing first. I actually found that I need to do those tasks the second half of my morning or the early afternoon, and I need to read in the morning. Because if I try reading in the afternoon, my brain is so fried from meetings and like doing everything like that, I can't get it to focus. So that's my hardest task of consistent reading that I have to now tackle first thing in the morning where it's more quiet. But that came with a lot of trial and error. But
Yeah.
everyone's different.
Yeah, you're more type A where you're like counter. My learning looks like I have like 2 or 3 things I need to get done, and once those are done, I'm just gonna go to the park and bring a book and just hang out for like 3 hours. That is so I'm trying to like, spend more time learning. Learning is just like what I'm doing when I'm not doing anything personally.
Yeah.
And I have journaling practices also, and my writing time is the time that I have like blocked out in the morning.
So that actually is a good transition to one of the last topics I want to talk about. Something that I've been forcing myself to do is journal more often, and that's because I really want to see the iteration of my thoughts and progression like we track our workouts. When someone says, I don't have time to journal or I don't necessarily want to journal, talk me through why you love it so much and the benefits you've gotten from it.
It's the same concept we talk about with regards to why I write. Right? When I journal, all of my thinking is now on paper where I can clarify, I can push through it. And I'm dedicating time and space, just like let my mind keep thinking and pondering. And journaling is where most of my ideas come from. I really like, if you're interested in accelerated learning, a very short, easy book, it's new, he did a great job with it, is Skip the Line by James Altucher. And something he suggests is in your journaling practice is come up with 10 ideas every day. Write 10 ideas every day. And if you can't generate 10 ideas, generate 20. And it goes back into our concepts of lowering the stakes. Journaling is also a time where it's like my windshield wipers, I can kind of, once I can get something down, I can now like, okay, I can stop obsessively thinking about that. Right. So it's also that time to, get things out of my brain and onto paper. Just like
I
writing.
like that.
Except more personal,
I like that.
And
Yeah.
I think people are like, oh, do you have prompts or do you like always do the X, Y, or Z? It's like, no, I'm literally just whatever I'm thinking about. Sometimes I'll go, I did this, then I did this, but most times like this one thing happened and I need to think about it for the next 20 minutes. And this is how I'm going to think about it. It's going to be through the medium of my journal.
Yeah. And for me, I found it very therapeutic too, because like it helps me brain dump. So like, this morning I woke up with a ton of anxiety. Like I have this move, I have all these other things I have to work through. And then I wrote it out and I was like, oh, I just needed to get it on paper and out of my head. So that was super helpful. Cool. So as we're about to wind down, one of the things that I notice a lot when we do, like whether I'm doing interviews with someone or just like watching interviews, is sometimes the person seems like a little bit way too far out of reach. That, Dave, if anyone saw you in New York City walking around, what's like a weird, quirky, interesting fact about you that you don't really like tell people as much, but you want somebody to know about you?
That I don't tell people? I feel like most of the weird, quirky things about me, I tell everyone all the time. There's a question I stole from Tim that I really like asking on first dates, and it's, what's something you do that other people think is insane? And of course I ask this question because I have a good answer for it. And that is, I carry around Vermont maple syrup with me everywhere because it's so hard to get real maple syrup places, and I'm just like a huge maple syrup slut, and I literally could drink it. Like, I think most people from Vermont could. So if you find me, my little briefcase with my laptop in it also has like a little thing of maple syrup. So that's
funny.
That's one weird fact. I don't think it's weird.
That's why you smell so good, ladies.
It, but I guess so.
And we also just got one more question from Connor as we wrap up. He asked, what would you say your favorite branch of journalism is?
I don't know, Con. Con's my boy. Con, shout out to Darien, Connecticut. And Con has a new puppy who I haven't met yet, who I've heard is very cute. I don't know. Brett, do you have a favorite branch of journalism? I don't even know that much about journalism, so that's kind of out of my wheelhouse.
Mine's
Text me and let's talk about it.
Yeah. For me, I love reading political articles because that's like my bread and butter where I grew up for 5 years doing that. But that's all. I mean, that's mostly rhetoric, then less news and more opinion based.
Yeah, I think the literary stuff, in terms of, I think Janet Malcolm's books, her great book, The Journalist and the Murderer, is a really good take on like kind of some of the ethical questions around journalism. I think if you're getting into journalism, that's a good place to start. And then I'll give a shout out to my really good friend, Asher Lair Small. He writes about education in a really thoughtful way. So you should follow him on Instagram and read his stuff.
Yeah. And then last note too, when people are starting to decide what to consume, I have found that getting on really good email lists that kind of give me small snapshots of what's happening in industries I'm interested in have been a great way for me to get broaden my understanding of what's going on in the world, and then have certain specific books. But I like reading like what's happening in crypto, what's happening in politics, specifically Middle East, are like two things I read every single day.
I like that. That's a good tip. So, Con, I would say find some good email lists. That's good advice.
Yeah. Any
Cool.
final words to our friends that have spent 41 minutes with us, and it's been such a joy?
Yeah, no, this has been super fun. I would just leave you guys with a really good quote I like from Naval Ravikant. That is, I'm going to butcher it. I didn't memorize it before I came on this, but it's not like the only thing scarce in our world is the desire to learn. If you have a desire to learn and like have a growth mindset or anything, I think like with the resources we have available, like we have so much right at our fingertips. A lot of it's completely for free. Are willing to invest in and continuing to grow and learn, you're going to be just fine. Like life's going to be great for you.
That's amazing. All right, everyone. David, thank you so much for being here. You're my
Thanks,
boy.
Brett. This
I
is
love
fun.
hanging out with you.
Yep. You too, brother.
And I'll see you soon. If I don't see
Cool.
you beforehand, I'll see you in New York in September.
That's right. Awesome. All right, Brett.
Cool.
Love
All
you,
right,
buddy.
guys. Thank you for being here.
See ya. Thanks for coming, everyone.